Hey, welcome to Real Estate Resource. Thanks for stopping by. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. I really hope you enjoy this video.
All right, so last week we were in paragraph 7. We had talked about condition of property. We talked about the as is. We talked about repairs. We went through all of that stuff last week. So if you need a refresher on that, you can go back to the YouTube channel, take a look at last week's class with that. So where we left off was sellers to remain in possession. So we'll talk about that before I share screen and we start looking at the contract. Does anybody have any questions about anything? No? All right. So you guys should be looking at the RPA. Change that. Let's, sorry, I'm just trying to make sure I got all my ducks in a row here. All right. Okay, so let's talk about the seller remaining possession. Seller to remain in possession. So remember, these paragraphs that we're looking at now are the explanation, the expanded paragraphs for the previous paragraph 3, right? So all of the terms that we negotiated, any terms that were accepted in the contract, were all negotiated in paragraph 3. These are those expanded paragraphs that are referenced there that will kind of go into detail and explain that part of the contract. So let's talk about sellers remaining in possession. So if the seller has the right to remain in possession after close of escrow, the parties are advised to consult with their insurance and legal advisors for information about liability and damage or injury to persons and personal and real property. Consult with a qualified real estate attorney where the property is located to determine the ongoing rights and responsibilities of both buyer and seller with regard to each other, including possible tenant rights and what type of written agreement to use to document the relationship between the parties. Buyers advised to consult with buyer's lender about the impact of seller's occupancy on buyer's loan. So what it's doing is it's just saying, hey, listen, you can agree to have the seller remain in possession after the close of escrow for the whatever amount of time you guys want to negotiate and agree to. But for the buyer, you've got to check with the lender and find out how that affects the loan that you're obtaining to be able to purchase the property. As the seller and the buyer, you got to figure out how that affects the insurance, right? As seller, does my insurance still cover my personal items? If there's a fire, if there's an issue, if I'm there for a certain amount of time, do I now inherit tenant rights? So all of those things have to be looked at. Now, we know just from experience that most lenders will not allow over 60 days, right? Even FHA will allow you to have a rent back for 60 days. Anything past that, and it's going to affect your qualifying for the loan. It starts to affect the tenant's rights, things like that. So 60 days should be our target for how long we allow people to remain in possession. And when it's talking about the forms, we talked about those in paragraph 3M, which is 29 days or less, it's the seller's license to remain in possession. 30 days or more, and it's the residential lease after sale, or the RLAS. Those are the forms that you're going to look at. At close of escrow, seller assigns to buyer any assignable warranty rights for items included in the sale, and seller shall deliver to buyer available copies of any such warranties. Agents cannot and will not determine the assignability of warranties. So we're not responsible for that. And what they're talking about is if there's any items that are included in the sale, those personal items that become part of the sale that we talked about earlier, they're referenced in paragraph 3P. If there are any warranties that are still in effect on those items, it's the seller's duty. It's their responsibility to provide copies of those warranties if they still have them, or the information on how to get those warranties taken care of. Seller shall, on close of escrow, unless otherwise agreed in writing, and even if seller remains in possession, provide keys, passwords, codes, and/or means to operate all locks, mailboxes, security systems, alarms, home automation systems, internet, and internet connected devices, including the purchase price, garage door openers, and all items included in either paragraph 3P or paragraph 9. If the property is a condominium or located in a common interest development, seller shall be responsible for securing or providing any such items for association amenities, facilities, and access. Buyer may be required to pay a deposit to the homeowners association to obtain keys to the accessible HOA facilities. A lot of stuff. Basically what it's saying is, it doesn't matter if I, the seller, am remaining in possession for 4 days or 40 days, I'm still supposed to, at close, give you copies of all the keys, all the garage door openers, the internet access. I have to give all that stuff to the seller or to the new buyer when we close escrow. That's why it's super important that we use the forms and use them properly, like the SIP, for example. If I'm remaining in possession for a very short period of time, right, 29 days or less, there's no reason for me to give keys to the buyer as if I'm a tenant. And that's what they're basically treating you as a tenant, because for those of you guys that own property and you're landlords and you have tenants, you have copies of keys. You have copies of you have extra garage door openers. You have access to the property. Doesn't mean you can go in whenever you want, but you have access to the property. So this is still really reverting back to that tenant-landlord relationship that says if you, seller, are remaining in possession and you're no longer the owner of the property has to have access to the property, which means keys, access, all that stuff. With the SIP, those 29 days or fewer occupancy dates, they have a box that you check that says that the keys and everything will be delivered to the new buyer when the seller moves out. So you just have to be careful that you do that. And I think the thing is that most people don't really read this, know about it. So buyer's agents, when they have sellers that remain in possession after close of escrow, they're not asking for it. They're not asking for this stuff. They're getting it when the seller moves out. So the problem is that if you don't know it as listing agent and you don't handle the process properly, and we get a buyer's agent that knows the contract and starts asking for this stuff, you don't have a legal leg to stand on. So if you don't provide it, you could be incurring damages for your seller, which then would revert back to you as listing agent. So keep that in mind, okay? Any questions about the seller remaining in possession at this point? Yeah, go ahead, Jesus.
My concern is not really about the tenants or the sellers. My concern would be, what legality do we have with the insurance? Because I actually have never asked insurance if the house is covered while the tenants are there, or what liability do we have while
Well,
the
the seller
owners are
remains.
there?
What liability do you have? You don't have any liability, but could your new buyer have liability? Yes, their insurance is already being covered. So you guys have to really look into that. Nobody does. Nobody goes into, hey, listen, how does the insurance work? Does the seller,
Right.
while they're in possession, is their insurance? That's talking to the insurance companies and find out what the coverage is going to look like before that happens.
Okay, but we don't
But
really do that.
that's not. I'm not an insurance person, so I can't tell you how that works. You got to talk to your insurance people about the process and how that works for a seller remaining in possession for a buyer that is now the owner. Okay. Now, I mean, there is some liability on the seller that's remaining in possession because of the forms that we fill out, and that's the issue of having an SIP and having a residential lease after sales. It talks about who's responsible and liable and all of those things. But there's plenty of agents out there that don't use those forms. They just put in a counteroffer, sell to remain in possession, and they don't include an SIP. And there's buyer's agents that don't request it. And there's plenty of transactions that ultimately end up closing with a seller in possession that don't have any of that supporting documentation to help protect, or defend, help protect the new homeowner. So keep in mind that using the right forms will help. But if you're concerned about insurance coverages for fires or damages, then you got to talk to the insurance people about that. All right, so let's look at contingency removals. You're welcome. Contingencies and removal of contingencies. This agreement is, unless otherwise specified in paragraph 3L1 or an attached CR form, contingent upon buyer obtaining the loan specified. If contingent, buyer shall act diligently and in good faith to obtain the designated loans. If there is no appraisal contingency, I like that they put this in bold, or the appraisal contingency has been waived or removed, then failure of the property to appraise at the purchase price does not entitle buyer to exercise the cancellation right pursuant to the The loan contingency, if buyer is otherwise qualified for the specified loan and buyer is able to satisfy lender's non-appraisal conditions for closing the loan. So again, and I've been, I talked to an agent yesterday. We were going through offers. They got, I don't know, 7 offers that they had to go through to present to their seller. And we were just, she was deciding which offers to counter. And many of those offers were sent with no appraisal contingency. And I understand the tactic from a buyer's perspective. Do not agree with it, right? And then from a listing side, I think we have to start looking at this no appraisal contingency as what it is basically a stunt, right? Hey, I know that I have to get an appraisal done, right? I know I have to get an appraisal done. The majority of the people that are writing the offers on these properties that are saying no appraisal contingency and are writing offers over asking price do not have anywhere near the funds that would be necessary if it doesn't appraise for that offer price. If they aren't showing you the funds necessary to make up that gap and they're removing the appraisal contingency, there should be a red flag going off in your head. Because if they don't have the money and it doesn't appraise and they have no appraisal contingency, how on earth do you expect that this transaction is going to continue once the property doesn't appraise? So we've got to be smarter as listing agents, and we have to see through this charade that is, hey, I'm going to remove my appraisal contingency, because it's nonsense. So we have to start as listing agents getting into the habit of conversations with our sellers. I'll get to you in a second, Joseph. Conversations with our sellers about why the process exists, what has to happen when somebody submits an offer without an appraisal contingency, and what that means and doesn't mean. Because we know we're going to have to get an appraisal anyway. So they might not have an appraisal contingency, but if they're financing 99.9% of the time, they need an appraisal. Now, I know there are times when, the price point and the amount of cash that the people are putting down and things like that, sometimes appraisals, they do desk appraisals and things like that, but that's very rare. So we have to just change our MO. We can't also, we buy into it. We love it as listing agents, right? Somebody sends us out, ooh, no appraisal contingency, right? We got them locked in. They're going to pay the difference. No, they're not. Not if they can't. How do you expect them to do it? And if you think that you're going to keep their deposit, come on, man. Most of the time, even when a seller is rightfully due the deposit, the majority of the time they don't get it because they want to sell their house. They don't want to collect deposits. So let's start rethinking strategies, right? For us as buyer's agents, that the idea that our strategy to make my offer strong is to remove an appraisal contingency when I know I still need an appraisal, when my plan is that I still plan on canceling or using a contingency to cancel. I've talked to you guys, and those of you that watch the videos and are on contract class religiously, and you guys are on here a lot, you know that the loan contingency doesn't protect you anymore if the only reason you can't qualify for the loan is the appraisal. But there's plenty of agents out there that don't know that, because in the last 2 weeks, I've had at least 3 conversations with agents where they said, well, we'll just use our loan contingency even though they removed their appraisal. And I had to inform them that they were mistaken, and it made them feel a little uneasy. Okay. Joseph, go ahead.
Two things. So I guess buyer's agents, I guess buyer's agents would assume, let's do a scenario. So 600,000 is list price. And they offer 30,000 over. So I guess they're assuming or hoping that the appraisal comes in at value, right, when they remove it, right? Correct?
Yeah, of course they're hoping it does.
Yeah, they're like shooting in the dark, kind of.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and second is, if you were a listing agent and you were gonna accept an offer 30,000 over with the removed loan appraisal contingency,
mm-hmm,
make sure they have that extra 30,000 in the bank.
That would be my requirement in the counter.
At minimum.
My requirement in my counter on anybody who's removed an appraisal contingency is they've got to show me proof of funds to pay the difference, right? The extra money to pay the difference between my list price and their offer price. right?
Perfect.
Because if they're going to go 30 or 40 over, I don't have any confidence in your offer price. I have confidence in my list price. I listed that price because I thought this is the price that's going to cause it to sell. This is the price that it's going to appraise for. I shouldn't have appraisal issues at this price. So if I listed my property for 600 and you're offering me 650 or 660, there better be, besides your down payment and the closing costs that you need to close, there better be an additional $60,000 in that escrow to make up the difference between 6 and 660. I want to see it. If you can't do that, then we're not going to accept your offer. Because why? So that I can go into escrow. Otherwise, if that's the case, if that's what I want to do, because I know what's going to ultimately happen. Buyers agents use this tactic because, one, they hope that it's going to appraise and they'll close. The fallback is we'll just fight with the listing agent and the seller until they agree to reduce a price to a price that makes sense, which really is the most reasonable thing to do. For you guys as listing agents, the conversations should be, I don't care that they remove their appraisal contingency. They have to have an appraisal. You, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, you agreed to sell at 600. It's amazing that we got an offer at 660 and 670. I wish we would have got an offer at $1 million. But the chances of it appraising at 660 and 670 are probably going to be pretty slim, just based on the comparables that exist out there. And you and I went over it when we decided to sell your home. I need you to be prepared. As much as we would love to get the 670 or 680 or 660 or whatever the overage is, I need you to be prepared that if it fails to appraise, we're going to have to reduce our price either closer to or at that appraised value. I need you to be prepared to do that. And then I'm going to follow up that conversation with an email that says, hey, we talked about it and you guys were on board that if it doesn't appraise, we're going to have to be open to the idea of renegotiating price and reducing because the people don't have the money to pay the difference. And that's the truth. So I either have to have that kind of, difficult conversation with my sellers or make sure they understand that from the very beginning. Like, that's probably something from the day they list the property, like, hey, we may get offers over. And if we get those offers that are over asking price and it doesn't appraise, you've got to be prepared to renegotiate the price. That's got to be something I start setting up from the beginning, but not us, because we're just as greedy as the sellers are. Man, if we get 70,000, that means more commission for me, and I'm going to get you more money, and then I'm going to go online and I'm going to say, I got this house to sell for more. We don't care about giving good service to the seller. What we care about is being able to go on Instagram and brag that we sold it for more. And so I think that ultimately what we have to do is start getting into the idea that we're having conversations. Now, if it ultimately ends up selling for that price, great. But the thing is that if we don't start planting that seed of the idea that we may have to renegotiate from the very beginning with the seller, then we get into those fights where it has to be that or it cancels. And that's not where you want to be. Okay. So just keep in mind that the tactic maybe is a little bit flawed because I think people are starting to catch on to the fact that, well, you have to appraise anyway. And I'm probably going to have a tough time keeping your deposit if you guys don't do what you say you're going to do. So maybe just write stronger offers and write what's a good offer and have good communication with the agents. And hey, listen, if a listing agent counters you to remove your appraisal contingency, and it's the only way you can get your offer accepted, and you explain the process to your buyer and your buyer says, yeah, go for it, then go for it and live within that. But cover yourself. Follow up with an email with that buyer that, hey, remember, I explained to you this is X, Y, and Z, what could happen to you if you remove the contingency, but you're choosing to move forward and do it anyway. And if they say yes to that email, go for it because now it's on them. Okay, I got a couple questions in the chat here. How long does the seller have to respond in order for you to send the EMD after buyer sends cancellation? My buyer never removed contingencies. There is no time limit. There's nothing in the cancellation says you have X amount of time to release and respond to this cancellation. It doesn't say that. Then you fall back into, well, depending on the amount of the deposit that's due back to the buyer because they hadn't removed contingencies. It could be small claims, it could be mediation, arbitration, it depends, but there is no timeline in there for a response. Next question is, if we remove loan contingency or any contingencies in the contract, but we do not use the CR as removal contingency. Okay. So for the appraisal and the loan, if it says because there's a box that says appraisal contingency removed, loan contingency removed, that box exists in the purchase agreement, then that contingency is removed. It doesn't require a contingency removal. If you remove anything else, like your inspections, investigations, stuff like that, that requires a contingency removal. Okay, you need to send a CR with that for it to be removed with the offer. Okay, all right. Let's see what do we got here. Buyer is advised to investigate the insurability of the property as early as possible, as this may be a requirement for lending. We all know that it is. Buyer's ability to obtain insurance for the property, including fire insurance, is part of buyer's investigation of property contingency. Failure of buyer to obtain insurance may justify cancellation based on the investigation contingency, but not the loan contingency. So keep in mind, if you guys wait until after you've removed your investigation contingency, because generally the fire insurance and stuff gets attached to your lender and getting the loan qualified. If you can't get insured after you've already removed your investigations and inspection contingency, you may not be able to cancel if you can't get insurance. And it's not impossible that you can't get insurance. It happens, okay? Or there's really expensive insurance or whatever the case is. So what I would suggest you guys do now in that first 7 days is make sure that your buyer has talked to a fire insurance, to into an insurer, whoever that is, your insurer. Call your lender and say, hey, what insurance company do you use? Tell your buyer to go online and Google, 3 or 4 different insurance providers and call them and try to get quotes on insurance. But do that in the first 17 days so that if there is an issue, the insurance is prohibitively expensive, or they can't get insurance because of where the property is located, they can cancel within the first 17 days and not put their deposit in jeopardy. Once they remove that investigation inspection contingency, if they can't get insurance, they can't cancel for any other contingency. They could lose their deposit. Okay, so keep in mind that about the insurance. Buyer's contractual obligations regarding the deposit, balance of down payment, and closing costs are not contingencies of this agreement unless otherwise agreed. Okay, so those things, they're not necessarily a contingency. Okay, even though they're attached to the loan and the terms that were accepted, they're not a contingency. Okay. If there is an appraisal contingency, or removal of the loan contingency shall not be deemed removal of the appraisal contingency. So, for example, if for some reason we remove the loan contingency, but we have removed the appraisal and then it doesn't appraise, just because we remove the loan does not mean that the appraisal has been removed. The reason I think they put that verbiage in there is because years ago, the appraisal and loan contingency used to be tied together. They were like one contingency. They were 2 separate ones. They were tied together. Loan and appraisal was one contingency. Okay. No loan contingency. If no loan contingency is checked in paragraph 3L1, obtaining any loan specified is not a contingency of this agreement. If buyer does not obtain the loan specified and as a result is unable to purchase the property, seller may be entitled to buyer's deposit or other legal remedies. And so this is why I always say, especially in this case with this no loan contingency, this is more about the idea of the hard money loans. I just talked to somebody about this yesterday. If you're going to obtain a hard money loan, do not mark that all cash in paragraph 3 because it automatically removes the loan contingency. And hard money loans still have conditions. I know they're not the same. The qualification's not the same. It's not as hard. There's multiple lenders. You'll probably find one. But if you don't, and you've removed that loan contingency because it's hard money loan, no problem, and it doesn't work, you could lose your deposit if you can't close the deal with the cash. So you got to, number one, if you're going to write it as all cash with an option of getting hard money loan, you better make sure that you actually have the cash to complete that purchase. Because if you don't have a loan contingency and the hard money lender doesn't work for you, or you can't figure it out, or the terms aren't right, you could be putting your deposit in jeopardy because by writing an all cash offer, you've removed your loan contingency. Go ahead, Jesus.
So that's when we put all there, right?
Yeah. No, well, you don't even have to put other. Like, what I would do is just you're talking about in the financing, put other in financing. You could, if you want to put it right there in the financing section, but you don't have to. What you do in additional financing terms, and let's go back just so I could tell you, right? Not in other terms, but additional financing terms, which is right here, right? So I can write the offer as cash. Just I don't want to check this box, because I check that box and it removes the loan contingency. So I don't check it. So let's say the purchase price is $500,000. It's going to be either all cash or hard money. That's fine. I don't put anything in here. I leave this as zero. I put balance down payment here, purchase price total there, and then here in additional financing terms, I put buyer will either purchase the property all cash or may obtain hard money, private money financing. And I put that in there. And as long as the seller accepts it, I'm good. But what's happened is I still have a loan contingency when I get down here because this box isn't checked. Doesn't matter if I put financing in the financing section. I still have a loan contingency, and I've disclosed in additional financing terms that I may try to obtain hard money financing or private money financing, whatever you want to call it. I'm putting it in there. The thing is that we don't want, if you want the option of hard money, don't remove the loan contingency. That's all I'm trying to tell you, is because we never know what could happen with those conditions. All we're trying to do is keep you protected, your buyer protected, or you protected. That's the point of it. Okay? Questions? Any questions? Okay, so that's the no loan contingency stuff. Appraisal. This agreement, unless otherwise specified in paragraph 3L2 or on an attached CR form, right? So 3L2 and 3L1 have specific places to mark no loan contingency, no appraisal contingency. But you could also attach a CR and say we're removing all contingencies. Contingent upon a written appraisal of the property by a licensed or certified appraiser at no less than the amount specified in paragraph 3L2. Default is the purchase price unless you put something different. Without requiring repairs or improvements to the property. Appraisals are often a reliable source to verify square footage of the subject property. However, the ability to cancel based on the measurements provided in the appraisal falls within the investigation of property contingency. The appraisal contingency is solely limited to the value determined by the appraisal. For any cancellation based on the appraisal contingency, buyer shall deliver a copy of the written appraisal to the seller upon request by seller. So, two things in there. If the appraiser does the appraisal and it says, oh, this property is only 1,200 square feet, but your assumption was it was 1,500 square feet, and you've already removed your investigations and inspections but didn't do your homework, right? Because remember, most sellers will be off the hook based on the disclosure of the square footage because they're doing it from a third party, which is the county tax assessor, right? The information that we get from title. So they can't necessarily be held liable for that unless they did some kind of modification of the property that changed the square footage. So what this is saying is if you find out from your appraisal that the square footage is off and you choose to cancel because of that change in square footage of what you thought you were getting than what you are getting, if you don't have your investigation contingency still in place, you can't cancel for that reason. You can only cancel if the value doesn't come in. So if the value still comes in, even though the appraiser thinks that the square footage is less, then your appraisal contingency will not protect you for that. Okay. The other thing is if it doesn't appraise and you use your appraisal contingency, excuse me, to cancel, you're required to give a copy of your appraisal. You're required to give it to the seller. Okay, so you can't say, no, you don't get it. You're required. Now, as listing agent, I think all of you guys should be putting in your counteroffers when, buyer to remove appraisal contingency in X amount of days and provide seller with completed copy or complete copy of a final appraisal. Like, put it in your counter, make it a term of the offer so that they can't ever argue with you if they don't give you a copy of the appraisal. Now, the only time they can't do that is if they're not paying for it. If the lender ultimately is paying for that appraisal, then the buyer doesn't own it and they can't share it with you. That would be the only argument that somebody would have. Joseph, go ahead.
So it's a two-question part. So first part is that why it's better to get the appraisal first and then the inspection second? So that way that would pop up. And is that kind of
no, I mean, I don't think it's, I mean, that's a pretty quick appraisal to get it done before you be doing your home inspection. No, I'm just saying that make sure that your contingencies are still in place. And if your concern is that there's something wrong with the square footage, right? It seems off. I mean, you're gonna notice appraisers don't tape off houses, right? They don't run a tape measure through there and do it unless it's something that looks completely off. If you'll see, if wait a minute, this says it's 1,500, doesn't feel like 1,500 square feet. This bedroom is this by this. If you start to get the inkling that there is an issue with the square footage that you thought you were getting, that then it becomes your time to go do your investigation, your due diligence as a buyer. That's your job to figure it out. I mean, the appraisal is just going to say, you know, that very rarely is the appraiser going to notice that something is super off unless everybody can notice that it's super off. That's all. You know, you'll know if there's a problem.
Second question would be, so is that why a lot of listing agents put like buyer to check the square footage, because they probably did like a illegal add-on or unpermitted?
Well, I don't know. I think they just do those statements like, you know, buyer to verify with city on anything, just because it's like a blanket, they think, protection.
Oh, okay.
Right? Like it is and it isn't, right? If I say to you, hey, go do your due diligence, well, thanks, but it's like writing as is. Yeah, I know I'm supposed to go to, like, that's the part of the investigations, right? And you can look at it. What it's trying to do is, I think that most people who do that, like, hey, you go do your due diligence, they know that they didn't get permits. They made some changes.
Right,
they didn't get permits. I think they think that because buyers and buyers agents, for lack of a better term, are lazy and they aren't going to go to the city and check permits and do those things. They're not going to do that much due diligence. They can get away with it. But if things were done without permits and they should have known as seller, it doesn't protect them. What you should do is, if I'm an owner and I bought a house and it had something that seemed funky and I didn't do the job of finding out if it was permitted or not, and you stay on there, hey, this room may or may not be permitted, buyer to verify. That's different because it was there when I bought it. It wasn't me doing the work. I just didn't go do the work to verify it. And so I'm telling you, hey, I don't know, this room may or may not be permitted. You go check it out. Now, that way, what I'm telling them is that I don't know if it is or isn't. I didn't do the work, but I'm just letting you know that I don't know. So you need to double check, because it isn't your job as listing agent. Look, if I was a seller, if I was an owner of a property, or if I was buying a property, you guys as agents get more and more experienced, you can kind of look at a property and tell this stuff was done, may not have been done with permits. And there's certain things that happen that aren't done with permits. Like, you know, people, you know, reconfigure bathrooms and kitchens, right? Like remodel bathrooms and kitchens and don't get permits. And so, you know, there's some things that you'll start to, as you get experience by going and looking at houses, you'll start to see like, hey, this seems like it's not something that should be here. Maybe we should check the permits. And that's the conversations we have to have with our buyers all the time is, you guys have to go to the city and check the permits on the property, because we can tell that there was stuff that was done. And we want to make sure that if they fail to disclose or forget to disclose, like, it doesn't have to be malicious. They could just forget. And if they forget to disclose something to us, we still want to make sure that you're protected. So just start making it a habit, you know, with properties, that you double check the permits with the city. Okay. Let's see. If no appraisal contingency is checked, the buyer may not use the loan contingency specified in 3L1 to cancel this agreement if the sole reason for not obtaining the loan. We've went over that in the loan contingency. Okay, so keep in mind, again, going back to that tactic of no appraisal contingency, think about the position you put your buyer in when you're writing those offers. You know, maybe that's why we look at the appraisal contingency in a more reasonable light that says, hey, look, here's the deal. If we write an offer over asking price, instead of not having an appraisal contingency, let's change the amount that the property is required to appraise for, and not have a contingency in place, right? So, like, for example, if I'm the buyer and I'm writing an offer over asking price, and I know how much money I have to play with, I have $10,000, I have $15,000 extra. I don't have the difference between list price and offer price, but I know that we have to be in this offer price to be competitive because of the other, you know, other buyers. Then what I would say is I would deduct from my offer price how much money I can spend the difference, right? So if I can spend $10,000 over, Instead of saying that the property has to appraise for 660, I say the property has to appraise for 650. Because if it's 650 or more, I'll pay the difference to that 660 price. If it's 650 or less, then I have the right to invoke my appraisal contingency. So instead of saying no appraisal contingency, I'm reducing it, saying, hey, listen, I still want to have some skin in the game here. As a listing agent, I can do the same thing. Instead of an appraisal contingency, what I could say is this: okay, well, you have an appraisal contingency, I'll let you have it, but it has to appraise for, if it doesn't appraise for my offer price, is the only way that you can invoke that loan contingency and walk away. Otherwise, you're committed to this. But then I have to follow that up with showing proof of, the funds to do that. So I think it's just strategy-wise, we have to start thinking about it from both ways. From a listing agent's perspective, like, how much do I want to deal with this nightmare of things not appraising, even though it doesn't have an appraisal contingency? And from a buyer's agent, how many times do I want to take the chance of putting my buyer's deposit in jeopardy because we're using this tactic to get our offers accepted? So again, it's just going to be a thought process, and I think an evolution of how we do business. Investigation of property. This agreement is as specified in 3L3, contingent upon buyer's acceptance of the condition of and any other matter affecting the property. That's disclosures and investigations and all that stuff. Review of seller's documents. This agreement is specified in paragraph 3L4 is contingent upon buyer's review of the approval of seller's documents required in 14A. We'll get to that in a little bit. Title. I'm not going to read the whole thing. It's just contingent, 305, on the buyer being able to obtain a title policy. That's going to be, we're going to talk about in 13G, what title policy that is. And look at, make sure that it's basically, we can get clear title, okay? Buyer has 5 days after receipt to review the revised preliminary title report, if any, furnished by title company. That's if there's a new one that comes out. Cancel the transaction if the revised preliminary report reveals material or substantial deviations from the previous provided preliminary report. So if a new prelim gets sent out to the buyer, just like with some of your mandatory disclosures, the mandated disclosures from the state, and we'll talk about those in a little bit, you get an extra 5 days to review, even if your contingencies have been removed. But all it's saying is, look, based on the prelim, we have the right to get clear title. The condo and the PUD disclosures is contingent upon the buyer reviewing those and approving those. And they'll talk about in 11K what those are. The buyer review of leased or lien items contingency. Buyer's review of and ability and willingness to assume any lease, maintenance agreement, or other ongoing financial obligation, or to accept the property subject to any lien disclosed pursuant to paragraph 9B6. We'll get to there in a minute. Is as specified in paragraph 3, a contingency of this agreement. Any assumption of the lease should not require any financial obligation or contribution by seller. Seller, after first delivering a notice to buyer to perform, may cancel his agreement with buyer by the time specified in 3L7, refuses to enter into any necessary written agreements to accept responsibility or obligations of seller disclosed leased or lien items. So again, I wanted to read that because I had somebody today ask me, where do I disclose that that the seller's not paying for the solar panels? Well, you kind of don't need to. It's already here. If we look at 3L7, right, we could go back. Review of lease or lien items is already here, 17 days. That's it. We have to provide copies of the leases and all of that stuff to them within the time specified for us, which is 7 days. So you have to give them everything about the solar lease there. And it says here, where we were just at right now, which is in leased or liened items, that the seller, after the seller has no responsibility right here, right, refuses to enter into a lease agreement, responsibility for all obligations of seller discloses. The seller doesn't pay for it. The buyer does. Right here. Lease shall not require any financial obligation or contribution from seller. So it already says in the contract, buyer's taking it over. They have 17 days to figure it out. If they don't figure it out, then we can cancel as seller, they can cancel as buyer. Okay. Removal or waiver of contingencies with the offer. Buyer shall have no obligation to remove a contractual contingency unless seller has provided all required documents, reports, disclosures, information pertaining to that contingency. If buyer does remove a contingency without first receiving all required information from seller, buyer is relinquishing any contractual rights that apply to that contingency. If buyer removes or waives any contingencies without an adequate understanding of the property's condition or buyer's ability to purchase, buyer is acting against the advice of agent. So what that's saying is this. Contractually, I don't have to remove my contingency of investigation, inspection, of prelim, of any of those things if I haven't received all the required documents from the seller. So if I send a contingency removal with my offer, removing all contingencies, but haven't seen any of those disclosures, they're saying in here, buyer, you're taking on the responsibility of doing that. And you're acting against our advice. Now, the problem with that acting against our advice is there better be some advice that they're acting against, which means we shouldn't be the ones that are saying, yeah, well, this is what we're going to do. We're going to remove all your contingencies, and that's how we're going to get your offer accepted. If you're doing that, you're responsible if they lose their deposit. The conversation should be this. Number one, you should never be the one saying, we need to do X, Y, and Z, remove appraisal, remove loan, remove that. You shouldn't be saying that. If a listing agent comes back and says, hey, you need to remove all this stuff to get your offer accepted, and then you tell them, okay, you can do it, but if you do, this is what you're doing because we haven't gotten all the information that we need, you're acting against my advice. But if you're the one who's advising them to do it, they're acting with your advice. So keep that in mind. When you try to show them, oh no, see right here it says you're acting against the advice of agent, but you told me to do it. Jesus, go ahead. You had your hand up. Go for it.
No, I was gonna mention about removal of contingencies for example, inspections. When we send the request for repairs and they don't answer, or they're presenting to the seller, and then they send us a notice to buyer to perform because we haven't removed them. Should we remove them even though they haven't answered those?
They're not required to answer your request for repairs, so you have to assume if they send you a notice to buyer to perform to remove that investigation inspection contingency that they're not going to do the repairs.
But if he start telling me he's presenting it, he's reviewing it, he's not shutting me down either.
Yeah, well, but again, you have to assume if they're sending you a notice to perform that you're not getting those repairs done. So that's the conversation with you and your buyer. Hey, listen, they're not responding to our request for repairs. There's no contractual obligation for them to respond to the request for repairs. They say they may negotiate it, or he's still presenting it, or still discussing with the seller, but they don't have any obligation to do those repairs. But now we've received this notice to perform to remove all our contingencies. We have to, as a team, assume they're not doing those repairs. Do you want to continue with the purchase of this home without those repairs being done? Yes or no? No? Great. Let's sign cancellation and get your deposit back and go find something else. Yes? Let's remove our contingencies then and let's continue on. That's it. That's how you work. You don't start see, this is the thing I think that we have to start understanding as agents. Should agents respond to your request for repairs even if the answer is no? Yes, 100% of the time. Are they going to do it? No. But then what happens is that we want to be right. So instead of just living within the world of the information that we have, which is they haven't responded yet and they've sent us a notice to perform, those two pieces of evidence tell me the chances are pretty good they're not doing the repairs that we want. And if they ultimately end up doing it after we remove our contingencies, hooray, we got a bonus. Then my attention needs to turn back to my client, not my fight with the listing agent because I want to be right. Turn back to my client and say, look, here's where we're at. The listing agent is unresponsive. We have to assume that they're not going to do the repairs just because of the steps that have just been taken. They've sent us a notice to perform. What do you want to do? Here's our options. What do you want to do? And then when this buyer says, this is what I want to do, then we, again, send an email to the buyer. Hey, I just want to confirm. We spoke this morning. We went over options A, B, and C with where we are in this position. You've chosen to take option B. That's what I'm going to do. I just want to make sure that you're still on the same page. Answer yes to that email. Great. I'm acting on behalf of my client. Here's what our next step is. Cancellation, removal of contingencies, whatever it is. Okay? So it has to be that way. The idea that we have to be right in the transaction, we've got to get away from that because it doesn't help anything and it doesn't work. It doesn't work. Joseph, go ahead.
Say I'm the buyer's agent negotiating with the listing agent. So based off what you just said, they could they verbally just tell me? Well, obviously they don't even have to respond, but could they verbally just say, "Oh, the buyers ain't gonna do it," and then leave it like that, like not even send the form signed?
Yeah, I mean, they could. Contractually, they could. But, I mean, again, if they're not returning it and it's time to remove the contingencies, that just has to be our assumption. I know people say, don't assume, makes an ass out of you and me. But all evidence points to the fact that that's not getting done. And even if they tell you, listen, sign the contingency removal, I'm still working on the seller. We still have to work under the impression that the seller is not doing that work. And I need to get the instruction from my buyer to take action, not us. And I think sometimes what happens is that we are the ones who are taking, and we, hey, don't worry, look, you love the house and it doesn't have this and doesn't have that, that's okay, this is what it's, you could do it afterwards, you could take your time, it's still livable, right? We convince them to take action, right? We convince them to do that. And then if later on they're unhappy with it, they can come back and blame us. So again, I got to make sure that I'm still getting my direction from my buyer as to how to take action on their behalf. And I think sometimes we just kind of take responsibility for taking action on their behalf and not really consulting them. And then even when we do, we don't back it up because phone calls is not enough. Because buyers forget, and so do sellers. Okay? So just keep that in mind. Okay. That was the removal of contingency or cancellation. For any contingency specified in 3L, 8, or elsewhere, buyer shall, within the applicable period specified, remove the contingency or cancel the agreement. Now, it's not that black and white. Like, that's what you're supposed to do. It's like, hey, day 17's here. We're supposed to remove our contingency or cancel and move on. But in between that, there's gray areas, right? There's extensions, there's per diems, there's all kinds of negotiations that go on. But just know that, contractually, the two options you have are to cancel and to remove your contingency and move on. For the contingencies for review of seller's documents, preliminary report, condominium plan unit disclosures, buyer shall, within the time specified in 3L or 5 days after delivery of seller documents or CI disclosures, whichever occurs later, remove the applicable contingency in writing or cancel this agreement. So any contingency that is reliant upon disclosures or documents being provided by the seller or a third, well, let's just stick it to the seller because even a third party is the seller, okay? I'm talking about NHD reports and things. Your contingency period is when you remove it or 5 days after you receive all that documentation from the seller, whichever is greater. So, seller has 7 days. I have 17 days. As long as the seller delivers all their paperwork, right, whatever disclosures and reports they're required to provide, from day 1 to 7, or actually from day 1 to 12, after acceptance, I still have to remove my investigation inspection contingencies on day 17. Once they get to day 13, 14, 15, then it's 5 days after I receive them. Okay, plain and simple. Days 1 through 12, it's still my contingency period. Any time after that, days 13 plus, it's 5 days after I receive them. That's all. That's how it works with that, okay? Sale of buyer's property. This agreement and buyer's ability to obtain financing are not contingent upon the sale of any property owned by buyer unless the sale for buyer's property form COP is checked as a contingency of this agreement in paragraph 3L8. That's it. Just very simple. Items included and excluded. Items listed as included or excluded in the multiple listing service, flyers, marketing materials, or disclosures are not included in the purchase price or excluded from the sale unless specified in this paragraph or paragraph 3P. Remember, just because it's in the disclosures, just because it's on the MLS, just because it's in a flyer on Facebook, on Instagram, on a TV commercial, on a radio commercial, doesn't matter. It is not included unless it's in 3P. It is not excluded unless it is in 3P. I don't care where it's written. Okay? You got to keep that in mind. Items included in sale. Now, this is going to talk about the stuff that is defaulted included in the sale. And I think we'll have enough time to get, well, maybe not all the way through, but we're going to try. We're getting close. I think probably next week is going to be our last class on the RPA. All existing fixtures and fittings that are attached to the property. Well, go ahead, Jesus, before I get into this. What's your question?
One quick question. It happened to one of the agents yesterday. This agent sold the property 2 years ago, and well, actually, she bought it with her client, and she was the selling agent, and they bought it as a duplex. The buyer just went to the city to get a permit on the roof, and it's actually not permitted. The property is not permitted, the little ADU. However, in the MLS, it says duplex. And I think he or she failed to check the status of
The MLS, I can already, you don't have to finish. The MLS is not binding. Nothing in the MLS is binding except for the commission being offered from one broker to another. Everything else is, if you look at the bottom of an MLS printout, which your clients aren't supposed to see, by the way, it says this information is deemed reliable but not deemed accurate but not reliable, right? Like it's just that, it's information. So no, because it said it was an ADU that was legal and it was a duplex and all those things, if the seller themselves built it without permits and didn't disclose it, the seller could be responsible. If the seller who sold it to them bought it like that, didn't disclose that it was unpermitted, and they didn't do their due diligence to go find out that it was unpermitted, then it's their fault. They're stuck with that.
Okay. But it has nothing to do with title either, title insurance.
No, nothing to do with title.
Thank you.
Title insurance is only for liens and encumbrances that were not reported or cleaned up. Right? That's what it's for. That's what title insurance is for. Okay. Existing electrical, mechanical, lighting, plumbing, and heating fixtures, ceiling fans, fireplace inserts, gas logs and grates, solar power systems, built-in appliances, and appliances for which special openings or encasements have been made, whether or not checked in 3P. So what that means is, let's say, for example, I have a freestanding stove, right, that has the burners on top and the oven underneath, but we built something special, like built the cabinets specifically around it, raised it up, built it, like, you know, the measurements are perfect, like nothing else will fit in there. Guess what? That's got to stay. But otherwise, if I have something that's built in, they stay without having to be checked in 3P as included. Window, door screens, awnings, shutters, window coverings, which includes blinds, curtains, draperies, shutters, or any other material that cover any portion of the window, and any associated hardware and rods, attached floor coverings, television antennas, satellite dishes, air coolers, conditioners, pool spa equipment, including but not limited to any cleaning equipment such as motorized automatic pool cleaners, pool heaters, pool nets, pool covers, garage door openers, remote controls, mailboxes, in-ground landscaping, water features and fountains, water softeners, water purifiers, light bulbs, including smart bulbs, and all items specified as included in paragraph 3P if currently existing at the time of acceptance. So what that says is all of those things, the pool skimmers, your smart bulbs that are connected to, like I have, are connected to my Siri or to my Alexa. If you don't want those to be included when you sell the property, before you start marketing, take out all the smart light bulbs so you don't have to leave them behind if you don't want to. But that list of stuff, you've got to have conversations with your sellers about what needs to stay, whether it's in there or it isn't. Now, if they don't want it to, then you've got to make sure that it's in the purchase agreement as excluded, and we'll get to excluded stuff, it looks like, next week. But if you see it currently exists at the time of acceptance, look, I know it says at a time of acceptance you can take it out, but if I market it with that stuff, I got to leave it in. Okay, note, if seller does not intend to include any item specified as being included above because it is not owned by seller, whether placed on property by agent, stager, or other third party, the item should be listed as being excluded in paragraph 3P or excluded by seller in a counteroffer. That's it. We're going to stop right there because it's already 11:56. We'll start up and hopefully we'll be able to finish next week. Any questions before we finish for the day? Anybody? Questions? No. All right, great. So, go ahead. I heard somebody unmute.
I say, not me.
Oh, all right. Okay, well then that's it for today. Thank you guys for being here. I'm gonna try to get through it and finish next Thursday so that we can be done and move on to something new. You know how to get me if you need me. If you missed any part of this, it's on YouTube afterwards. It'll be up there by later this afternoon, so you guys can check it out. Other than that, have a great day. Be healthy and productive.